return, I actually had the chance to speak with a DC Congresswoman, Eleanor Norton, on everything that transpired on the Capitol on Wednesday. And we even talked about her reaction to this viral image that you are looking at. And after that, we will have a live update from Fox 6 Milwaukee's Amelia Jones on what Congresswomen and lawmakers are actually doing to remove the president from office. But right now, again, I want to show you the full interview from DC Congresswoman Eleanor Norton.
Democrats had to be there to respond to the attack on what should have been a perfunctory matter of simply confirming the votes that had already been taken.
Can you describe to me where you were, what you were doing when you first were notified that protesters were breaking inside of the House chamber?
Well, I was, like most members of Congress, most of the time we are teleworking at home. We go in only for votes, and when you have to. There are not even, during this pandemic, committee hearings being held for the most part. So I learned about it the way most members learned about it who were not actually participating in it, from watching people like you on television.
And what were your thoughts?
My thoughts were that this can't be happening in the United States of America. This must be a banana republic I'm looking at. We don't have people invading the Congress of the United States. That was my first thought. My second thought was, where were the police? Why wasn't the Congress being fortified? Why wasn't the Capitol Police being fortified with other police forces and coordinating them? There needs to be a presidential commission when we have our new president, because we need to find out what happened, just like we did after 9/11. That was an attack on our country from outside. This was an attack on our country from within. No less deserves a presidential commission to find out what went wrong, because frankly, everything went wrong. It's not as if we didn't have notice. The president had essentially called these people to come to the Capitol, and he said, "Be wild." So we knew exactly what was going to happen, and we were not prepared. So glass was broken inside the chamber where I come to speak in the House of Representatives. The place was torn amok, and this during a pandemic. They've had to clean out the place in order for anybody to get back in. And I don't mean of just of glass, I mean a possible disease from the pandemic.
As you mentioned, this was a very high profile, anticipated event. We knew that President Trump would be speaking. We knew that there would be hundreds of Trump supporters there. And you mentioned that you wanted to see a little bit more from law enforcement. Did you at any chance maybe have discussions or thoughts that this possibly could get out of hand?
Frankly, I didn't anticipate it getting out of hand because of all the notice we had of what would happen. The president had called people to come to the district to be wild. So because there was so much notice, I didn't anticipate that there would be any trouble. The last thing I anticipated is they would invade the Capitol itself. That should have been fortified during an inaugurations and State of the Union. There's no way that the public can be admitted, can get anywhere close to the Capitol. This should have been treated like an inauguration, like a State of the Union, given the notice we had that people would be coming to do damage.
Now, you mentioned that you have been getting a lot of your news from us, the media, but also if you pay attention to social media, there are many photos that are circulating the internet that seem pretty surreal. We've seen representatives laying on the floor wearing gas masks, and I think one of the most startling photos that we've seen is the image of the rioter actually in Nancy Pelosi's office with his feet on her desk. Can you tell me, what was your reaction when you saw that viral image?
Well, my first reaction is the notion of penetrating the Capitol that far was really unthinkable. To get all the way to the Speaker of the House, and I'm not sure which, she has two offices. One is her Speaker's office, and the other is her office out of which she serves her constituents. Either one should have been impenetrable. But I think what that picture shows, and it's being showed all over television, is that there was no place in the Capitol that this mob could not get. That goes to the protection of the Capitol, insufficient planning by the Capitol Police, no lockdown of the campus, despite extraordinary notice. This would have been another thing if there had been no notice and all of a sudden there had been people downtown who decided to run to the Capitol. That was not the case. The president had essentially called this mob to the Capitol and used the words, "Go wild." Why were we unprepared? That's why I'm calling for a presidential commission. Yeah, let me speak to that. We have free speech in this country, but classically we're told that you can, free speech stops when you actually call for violence. That's what the president did. Now, I'm not sure he can be prosecuted. He can't. There's some people calling for him to be impeached again. Of course, we don't have time for that. On the 25th Amendment, no disability here, I don't think. But he committed these acts while he was in office. So I'm not sure he will ever be penalized or punished for them in any way.
What kind of legacy?
If you or I had done it, if a civilian had done that, had fomented a riot, there is a law that would have gotten us indicted.
The former Washington Police Chief Charles Ramsey, he was quoted actually saying the rioters ought to be in handcuffs right now, and they need to be locking them up without question. So to your point, what would have happened to civilians if we would have incited a riot? I want to talk about protests that we've seen in our country just within the past year, and how it was handled by law enforcement. For example, when the George Floyd protests were taking place last June, we saw armed National Guardsmen at Lincoln Square. What do you have to say when we compare the two events and how they were handled by law enforcement?
Well, it's an apt comparison. We saw armed law enforcement at Lincoln Square, and we didn't see anything like the kind of riots we've seen here. Perhaps even more indelible is we saw armed law enforcement guarding the Lincoln Memorial. That's guarding a statue. But we didn't see law enforcement down at the Capitol, guarding the Capitol of the United States, with people in it who had to cower, hide under desks, try to get out of the chamber. There, we didn't see law enforcement. When Black Lives Matter comes out for peaceful demonstrations, law enforcement is on the case, quickly doing its job without any threats of the kind we saw from the Trump rioters.
Now, looking forward, ahead of the president's inauguration on January 20th, what is the atmosphere like on Capitol Hill?
I already see construction of a 7-foot fence around the Capitol. I certainly hope that will not be permanent. I hate to see that kind of configuration in our Capitol, but it's called for at this time. But remember, in the inauguration and the State of the Union, the campus is always closed off to the public. And I think that's all that matters there. Ample preparations are being made, in fact, for a whole year in advance of any inauguration. Those preparations are being made. I must say, I hope that they are being altered somewhat in light of what we have just experienced on Wednesday night.
Congresswoman, if there's one takeaway that you would like our viewers to know, what would be that message?
The takeaway would be that we saw the resumption. I would like people to remember that we saw the resumption of the proceedings that brought forth this state of affairs. The proceedings to count the votes, or really not to count the votes, to confirm that the president had been chosen by the votes of the states. We saw that resume last night in the face of these riots. Rather than take away the riots, I hope people will bear in mind that this is a constitutional republic, and they could not stop us even for a night, even for an evening. And we continued and completed that constitutional process of affirming that Joe Biden had been elected president by votes cast by the 50 states.
And just one last question. Ahead of the certification, there were a few Republican senators who vowed to object to the certification process. And after the violence, they withdrew their objection. What are your thoughts on that?
I think they have to take responsibility for the objection. If perhaps these rioters would have come anyway, but this was their platform. This was what the president called them out to do in light of those objections. Those objections to the votes in 4 states, which have been counted multiple times, were for show. It's because they simply wanted to continue to back the president, no matter how outlandish were his claims of having won this election. So I believe that those who were involved in calling for the 4 states to be called out in that proceeding on Wednesday night helped essentially call the rioters to the Capitol, who came in a real sense to back them up. And back them up they did by, of course, breaking into the Capitol and destroying the very process they were engaged in. So I do think they got their comeuppance. They could not continue. They continued with one, and that was the end of it. So I do think that showed that what they tried to do, they were not successful in doing.
You're watching News Now from Fox. That was the latest from D.C. Congresswoman Eleanor Norton. She talks about everything related to the pro-Trump riots on Wednesday. And she has also introduced into Congress a bill that would allow D.C. to become a state. Just yesterday, we heard from D.C. Mayor Bowser, and she explained that if D.C. had a statehood when the riots occurred, she would have had more authority when it comes to issuing armed police officers in the D.C. area when this all happened. So we will continue.